If you have your Bibles with you, turn to or load up to or click over to Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. It's in the Old Testament, right after the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua, little known fact, Joshua is the story of Joshua. I don't know if you knew that. Start off with something real deep this morning. As you're turning there, I do want to bring you greetings from Pastor Jay. He is not here this morning. Our lead pastor is ministering in another church in New York City today. He is in the Big Apple, preaching at a missions convention there. Back in the month of September, we had a special guest come. His name was Stanley Pramnath, and Stanley was one of the survivors from the attacks on the World Trade Center. How many of you remember when Stanley was with us? Well, Stanley today is a pastor on staff in an Assemblies of God church in New York City, and that's where Pastor Jay is today. Pastor Stanley invited Pastor Jay to come and minister to their church during their World Missions Convention. So Pastor Jay is there today. He will be back Wednesday night. He will be back next Sunday. We will be back in our routine. And next Sunday will be a wonderful day. It's also important for another reason. Do you know what else is important on the calendar about next Sunday? Well, I just heard 14 different, I need to brush up on my calendar, I guess. I was going for Mother's Day. How many of you knew next Sunday was Mother's Day? And every teenager raised their hands. Good. Make sure you honor your mother, if that is possible for you to do next Sunday. It is my wife's first Mother's Day. We have a little son who turned 3 months old today. It is my wife's first Mother's Day this year, so I was trying to talk with my son about what we wanted to do for Mom for Mother's Day, and that lasted about 8 seconds. It was not very productive. I remember just a few weeks ago, it was about 3:30 in the morning. We were laying there in bed, and my son was in his third consecutive hour of screaming. And I looked over, and my wife, she was trying to comfort Chase. You know, she's trying to, console him. And she wasn't losing her temper. She wasn't being impatient. She was just being so tender and loving and kind. And I just looked at her, and I said, babe, I'm telling you something. For Mother's Day, you're getting a Lexus. And, right after that, we made this new rule that nothing I say between 3 and 4 counts. Because I have no way of making good on that, so I found a great Lexus keychain to get for her. But I do pray for her, and next Sunday is going to be a great day. Joshua, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. We'll get there in just a second. And my life was forever turned upside down in August of 1987. I was 11 years old, and my life at that point was very simple. You could divide it into 2 categories. In 1987, 11 years old, there was school and everything else. And a little bit of confession, I loved school. Up to that point, I loved elementary school. I loved it. How many of you have fond memories of elementary school? Let me see your hands. Okay. I loved school. More honestly, there was one main reason I loved school. One main reason. Recess. Loved recess. Not so much the teachers or the classes or eating paste or anything else that I could get into. I loved recess. I knew that 3 times a day, 5 times a week, for 15 minutes, my 20 best buddies and I would be released to the courtyard to play kickball. No matter what was going on in life, no matter what was going on in the classroom at 10:15, 12:15, and 2:15, I would get 15 minutes of heaven on earth, and that involved kickball. I loved it. It's what I lived for. It got me out of bed in the morning. That was my life, and I loved it. In August of 1987, I got off the bus and entered middle school for the very first time, and nothing was normal. The classes were bigger and harder. The building was enormous and intimidating. The teachers were serious and demanding. I could have handled all that in stride. But that first day of middle school, I was dealt a much more devastating blow. I learned on my first day of middle school that lunchtime for me would be between 11:15 a.m. and 11:45 a.m., and that was okay. I could handle that because I knew that I could get to lunch, inhale my food, and have 20 minutes left for kickball. So my first day of middle school, I got to the cafeteria first. I sat down. I inhaled the PB&J that my mom had made for me in 10 minutes. And I got up out of my seat and headed towards the doors that led from the cafeteria to the playground. And just as I was about to burst through those doors into the playground, one of the adult teacher lunch monitors stopped me with words that I have yet to recover from. She said, "Where are you going, young man?" "I'm going out for recess, ma'am." Then the worst words I've ever heard. Elementary school is over. This is middle school. We don't have recess here. Altar call right now. "Now then," she said, "go back to your table and sit there quietly until you are dismissed to return to class." I'm kind of choking back tears even right now. My whole world was crushed. They pulled the rug right out from under my feet. I loved me some recess, man. Recess had been good to me. Recess was great. I lived for recess. Now it was gone. Never to return again. I wasn't ready for recess to die. Yet, there I was, standing in the cafeteria, grieving over the loss of my recess, knowing I could never go back. So when did that happen for you? When did you figure that out? Not recess. Not recess. When did you figure out that life could change on you very suddenly without any advance notice? When did you figure it out that right when you get your whole life kind of figured out, you got it right where you got the schedule down, your friendships down, your routine down, very likely it could just change just like that. When did you figure out life constantly changes? For me, it was right then and there. And guys, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to convince us this morning that life changes. It just does. Sometimes life changes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Sometimes things get added to it, sometimes things taken away from it. Our health comes and goes. Our hair came and went. Relationships come and go. Laws change. Values of houses change. Things that are expected of us change. The rules change. I figured that out. And there I was standing in the cafeteria, grieving the loss of my recess. You know, our text for today finds young Joshua in a very similar situation. But he lost something a whole lot more substantial than his recess. Joshua lost the most important person in his whole world. When we read this text today, we see what happens when God showed up at a point of Joshua's grief, when everything had changed for him. His job was gone, his leader was gone, his identity was broken. He was alone. He felt abandoned. He was under tremendous pressure with no answers. He had been grieving Moses' death for 30 days. And then here's what God says to him in Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. I'll give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the great sea to the west. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will also be with you. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give to them. God came to Joshua in a time of tremendous grief and loss to teach him a very important principle that you and I can learn from as well. If I could summarize everything God said into 4 words, it would be this, and this is our big idea. Life changes. Lordship endures. Life changes. Lordship endures. I hope I don't have to spend another moment convincing you that life will change, friend. It just will. Whether you want it to or not, it's going to. Whether God makes it or it just happens is not our discussion today. Life changes. It changes constantly. Sometimes it's better. Sometimes it looks worse. Sometimes you get stuff. Sometimes stuff is taken away. It just changes. But God doesn't. God is the same. God is the one who says, I'm the Lord your God. I don't change. You see, God is not obligated to change with the seasons. God's not obligated to change just because your view of him changes. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He doesn't change. That means if he could ever bail you out, he still can. That means if he spoke to you even once, he still can. That means if God ever had a good plan for you, he still does. If God ever could, he still can. Life changes. Lordship endures. And that's what God was trying to communicate to Joshua in a moment where he felt like everything he depended upon was suddenly gone. Life changes. Lordship endures. I pulled 4 things out of there. There's probably more. I pulled four things out of there that I believe God was trying to communicate to Joshua. 4 principles Joshua pulled out of those first 2 verses when God talked to him. Here's the first one. God knows where to find you. God knows where to find you. Do you realize that up until this moment, God had never spoken to Joshua? This was the very first time Joshua ever heard the voice of God to him. Now, he was nearby Moses. He followed Moses up the mountain. Joshua was positioned in a lot of cool places, but he needed Moses to tell him what God said. This is the first time God ever spoke to him. And God came to find Joshua. Verse 1 says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide. Some translations say, after the death of Moses, the word of the Lord came to Joshua. God wanted to speak to Joshua, and he knew exactly where to look. He knew where he was. He was in the plains of Moab, by himself, grieving, depressed, scared, lonely. He knew where he was. And he knew exactly where to find him. I want you to notice something. God didn't go to the Holy of Holies to look for Joshua. Joshua wasn't in church that morning. That's not where he was. God didn't go look among the Levites who were offering sacrifices or singing songs of praise to find Joshua, because in that moment, that's not where he was. Listen, don't think you've got to get all cleaned up and all happy for God to find you. God knows where you are. You might be sitting here this morning and your brain is 1,000 miles away, right? Ever happened to you? That might not be one you'd be happy to raise your hand, but it happens. God doesn't just know where your physical coordinates are. He knows where you're at. He knows where to find you. You know where he found Joshua? He was alone. He was grieving. He was scared. How do you know he was scared? Because God told him 3 times to be strong and courageous. He was depressed. He was discouraged. He had no plan. He was suffering and grieving from a tremendous loss. And that's where God went to find him. I want to tell you something you already know. God knows where to find you. God's not scared to come look for you when you're bored. God's not scared or intimidated by your doubts, your fears. God doesn't need you to get all cleaned up and look real nice and pretty for him to find you. He knows what's really going on. He knows where to find you. Whether you're scared, confused, in doubt, bored, whether you're in transition, whether you're feeling insecure, I want you to know God's big enough to handle the emotions you go through when life changes. Just because you're doubting him doesn't knock him off his throne and make him less God. He's bigger than that. He's big enough to handle your tough questions. And that's where he went to find Joshua. Even when you may not be seeking God, or even when you don't want God to find you, God knows where to find you. Just because you're not seeking God doesn't mean he's not seeking you. I remember one time God found me when I wasn't looking for him. May of 1994, I was 18 years old. I was a month away from graduating from high school. I was at 1656 Book Road in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in my bedroom at 3 in the morning, wide awake, stressed out of my mind, because I didn't know what was next. I had a deadline and no answers. I had opportunities and no direction. I had a mandate from my parents. I don't care what you do after you graduate, but by August, you got to be up out of here. That was their way of moving me forward. And there I laid in my bed, stressed out of my mind. All my friends had everything lined up. I didn't. I had several plans I put in place, and they fell through. I was a month away from graduating, and I didn't know what was next. More importantly, I didn't care what God had for me. I was actively trying to shut it out. You see, my dad followed God's plan for his life. My dad became a pastor. Good for him. That made me a pastor's kid. I didn't pick that, and I didn't like it. Because the moment my dad followed God's plan, that meant a whole lot of change for me. I had to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, act a certain way, hang out with certain people, stay away from others. I couldn't go to the homecoming. I couldn't go to prom. I couldn't listen to certain music at home. I listened to it other places, just not at home. I couldn't go to movies. I couldn't go on dates. Not that that was a problem, but I couldn't. When I stood on the pitching mound to pitch for my baseball team, my dad wasn't in the stands because somebody at the church needed him. When I played football, my dad wasn't in the stands because the church needed him. When I came home to eat dinner, there was an empty seat where my dad was supposed to sit because he followed God's plan, and I got the raw end of the deal. When I became a teenager, I did everything I could to distance myself from God. I wasn't seeking him. I wasn't looking for him. If he had a plan for me and it was going to mess up my life like it did for my dad, I wasn't interested in it at all. Now, that might be strong words. I'm just telling you what I thought. It wasn't right. It's what I thought. I didn't want to follow God's plan for my life. I didn't even care what it was. As soon as I turned 16, I got my driver's license, got a job working Sundays, so I didn't have to go to church and be around the Christians who talked about my dad so horribly when he couldn't hear them. I immersed myself in sports, so I didn't have to go to the youth group at my church on Wednesday night. I did everything I could to distance myself from it. And yet, my plan was getting me nowhere. And there I laid in my bed, in my bedroom, on 1656 Book Road in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, not seeking God, not interested in him, stressed, depressed, confused. I had teal carpet and a teal bedspread because for some reason teal was cool. Aren't you glad times have changed? Sorry if you have a teal room, that's no condemnation on you. But there I was. But God wasn't too scared to show up in my bedroom and talk to me about what I was feeling and what I was thinking. He knew right where to find me. All I know is that at 3 o'clock, I sat up in my bed and I said out loud, "All right, I give up. If you've got something you'd like to tell me about my future, now would be a great time to tell me." And I'd like to tell you that he just rolled out a 19-step plan to move me from there. I couldn't have handled all that at that point. But here's what I remember God saying to me. You are stressed out. You're under a lot of pressure. I understand. You don't have a clue what you're going to do next. Now then, I've got a plan for you. And guess what? You'll probably really like it. We're not going to talk about that right now. Would you please just roll over and get some sleep and stop taking your problems to bed with you? And that was it. You know what I did? I rolled over and I went to sleep. And over the next few weeks, God began to roll out a plan for me that I am still chasing to this day. Because God wasn't too scared to come and find me in my doubt and my rebellion and my closed ears. Because even when you're not seeking God, don't think he stopped seeking you. Where are you this morning? Do you know where you are? God does. Well, I'm sitting in the third row, seat 4. Look, that's not what I'm talking about. Where are you today? Behind the freshly ironed shirt and the perfectly put on makeup. Where are you really? God knows. He knows exactly where to find you. And he's not afraid to come and see you at your point of need. That's the first thing Joshua figured out. Second thing, God knows your situation. He knows where to find you, but he knows your situation too. He knows the facts. He knows the truth. He knows what you're going through right now. God knew Joshua's situation. God wanted to speak to Joshua about his situation. But forgive me, I have to ask this question. Could God have been any more insensitive to Joshua's situation? God had never spoken to Joshua before. 30 days of silence, And the first thing God says is, Moses, my servant, is dead. Have you ever tried to comfort someone who's grieving the loss of a relative? How many of you have ever had to do that? You've been to a funeral, you've tried to offer. That's awkward at best. Because sometimes we feel like what I have to say isn't good enough. But I feel like something should be said. As a pastor, one of the things I'm called upon to do regularly is to administer comfort to people who are grieving the loss of someone they love. The last thing in the world I would ever think to do is go up and put my arm around someone who's standing in front of the casket of someone that they loved, and the first thing out of my mouth to be, they're dead. But what does God say? The first thing he says to Joshua is, son, Moses, my servant, is dead. Thank you, God, for that bulletin from the Department of the Obvious. I appreciate that. What was God thinking? Was he being rude? Was he rubbing it in? Was he just restating the obvious? Was he grossly oversimplifying a very complicated situation? I don't know what God was thinking entirely. Joshua was grieving over his past. He wanted his life to go back to the way it was before Moses died. He wanted to go back to when things were good and right and routine and comfortable. He wanted his old job back. He wanted his old routine back. He wanted his old relationships back. He wanted Moses to come back from the dead and tell him what to do. But there was no going back. He was grieving over his past. And a lot of times you and I get stuck grieving over our past. Sometimes we grieve over our past because it was really good, and we want to go back and relive it all over again. We want to go back to when we had more money or more hair or better relationships or someone who loved us. When we had recess and chocolate milk and life was great, no bills, no responsibilities. Joshua wanted to go back to when times were good. But other times we grieve over our past because we made mistakes in our past. And even though God's forgiven them and ready to move them on, we're not ready. And we beat ourselves up because we want to go back to our past and just wish, if only I could change things. You see, we're not so unlike Joshua. Many of us spend time grieving over our past. Surely Joshua was aware of the facts. He didn't need God to tell him Moses was dead. He knew. He had spent 30 days grieving and mourning and crying, being alone, trying to process how in the world he could find a new normal when everything that was important into his life, the man who meant the most to his identity, the person who he depended on even more than his own father, was gone. So was God just being insensitive by saying, Moses, my servant, is dead? No. If that was the only thing God said, we'd have to conclude maybe God was being insensitive. But that was far from God's intention. God wasn't being rude. He wasn't being insensitive. He wasn't beating Joshua up for mourning and grieving. And let me stop here to say something this morning. God will never beat you up for mourning and grieving. It is healthy. It is appropriate. It is necessary. When you suffer loss, you have to grieve. God wired us that way. God wired us in a way. Why do you think the Bible says Jesus wept when he lost Lazarus? Because Jesus himself needed to have the experience of grieving for somebody so he could empathize and sympathize with you and I when we go through the same thing. The Bible says there's a season and a time for mourning and grieving. The New Testament says when you see a brother or sister mourning or grieving, you don't pick on them. You don't tell them to suck it up and move on. You comfort them. So please don't hear me say one time this morning at all that if you're mourning and grieving over a loss in your life, that's not what God wants you to do. At no point did he ever pick on Joshua or rebuke him for grieving and for mourning. He was just trying to help him move through that process to get to a place of closure and acceptance and to move forward. So he wasn't chastising him. He wasn't being rude. He wasn't being insensitive. What God was doing is he was simply and gently coming alongside Joshua to say, I know and I understand your situation, son. Moses wasn't just your leader. He was my servant, and he's dead, and you're hurting, and I know. God knew the facts, but not only that, God knew what Joshua was feeling. God knew that Joshua felt weak, scared, alone, and doubtful. Why do you think God went on to say to Joshua, be strong, be courageous. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. Get up and do what I've called you to do. Why would he bother telling him that if he wasn't weak and scared and alone? God was speaking to Joshua saying, I understand where you're weak. I understand what you need to hear. And I'm going to speak right into that right now. He would have had no reason to say those things if Joshua was doing okay. God demonstrated to Joshua that he knew the facts, but he also was well aware of Joshua's emotional and mental condition. God summed up the whole deal with one black and white, cut and dried, point blank statement. And it was simply this: Moses, my servant, is dead. What's your situation today? If you had to summarize it in one cut and dried, point blank, black and white statement, what's your situation today? I hate my job and I see no way out of it. That's not my situation. Not my situation. Might be yours, not mine. I went to an interview, but I didn't get selected. My spouse and I don't love each other like we used to, and I'm a little scared. My financial future used to be secure. Now I don't know. It's been over a year and I'm still not any better. My marriage is over. I need an answer today and I'm hearing nothing. If you had to summarize your situation in one cut and dried, point blank, black and white statement, what would it be? I want to remind you something that you already know this morning. God knows your situation. He knows the facts. He knows the truth. But God also knows your feelings. He knows your specific and unique needs. God knows when your life changes, He's still Lord of everything. Even though your emotions might be different and life threw you a curveball and you didn't ask for it, it just landed on your doorstep, God's still in charge. He still reigns. He still has a plan, and He still understands. God knows your situation. But this was a pivotal point for Joshua. Joshua was there grieving. And if Joshua never moved from the plains of Moab, if he never somehow got over this and accepted it and moved on, the rest of this book reads a little bit differently, doesn't it? So what did God say to move Joshua from grief to growth? What did He do to give him traction? Joshua was stuck. He wasn't moving forward. He wasn't moving backward. He was moving nowhere. What did God say? 2 words. 2 words. If you get nothing else from this morning, remember these 2 words. There's 2 words that God said next. He said, Moses, my servant, is dead, period. And then these 2 words. You know what those next 2 words are? What are they? Now then. Now then. With those 2 words, God said a third thing. He said, I know your future. The story doesn't end here, Joshua. It doesn't end with you grieving over your past in the wilderness, alone and discouraged and depressed. I'm not trying to undo your past. I can't. But there was a now then moment for Joshua. The facts were that Moses was dead. The facts were that Joshua had grieved for an appropriate period of time. But now it was time for him to move forward. Now then are 2 very beneficial words for leaders to use when you're managing a time of crisis. Now then moves us from our situation to a next step. Now then moves us from the past to something immediate. Now then reframes our situation in a way that calls us to action. It works in a lot of different situations. You could walk into the workroom of your job, see someone standing in there alone having an audible, angry conversation with the copy machine. And as they go to pick up a sledgehammer, you intervene and you say, listen, I think the copy machine is not working right. Now then, let's go to the telephone and call the repairman. See how nice that works? Now then, son, there's no more recess. Now then, go sit down and wait until you're dismissed to your class. Now then, the medic in our unit is injured. Now then, sit tight, soldier. I'll get your IV started. I failed my midterm. Now then, I better figure out what I'm going to do different or mom and dad will kill me. Now then. Now then are powerful words. Snaps us into the immediate, gets us moving forward. One of my favorite now then moments in my own life happened when I was 8 years old. I loved Saturday mornings. Not just because of the cartoons. I was far advanced. I liked Saturdays because Saturday afternoon baseball was on television. And I loved baseball. I loved baseball cards. And every Saturday, my routine was to figure out which 2 teams were playing on television. I'd get out my baseball cards and I'd go through them and I would pull out the players that would be playing in the game so I could have them right there in front of me while the game was going on. Saturday morning was awesome. I had a routine set that I loved. And this particular Saturday morning, it was a wonderful Saturday morning. I had my baseball cards out on the table, and I found a souvenir cup in the cabinet, 64 ounces of souvenir cup available to this 8-year-old. And I filled it to the top with milk, and then I got the Hershey's chocolate syrup out, and I mixed it equal parts milk to syrup. Do not try this at home. I stirred that thing up till it was thick as molasses and dark as the night, just the way I liked it. And there I was, Saturday morning, baseball about to come on, my baseball cards, 64 ounces of chocolatey milk. It was wonderful. And I'm going through my baseball cards, and I'm sorting through them, and life is great and grand and just how I like it. And when I was going through the cards, all of a sudden I hit the souvenir cup, and 63.5 ounces of chocolate milk went everywhere, on my baseball cards, on the floor. I know, it's tragic, really, it is. These powerful emotions started to come over me. Now keep in mind, I'm 8. I was not yet the emotional rock that stands before you today. I knew, number 1, I was in big trouble. Number 2, there was no more chocolatey milk. Number 3, I didn't have a whole lot of time to clean up the mess before Mom came in the room. So I got down off my chair, and the emotions hitting me, and I felt my eyes well up with tears, and I had to blink, and a little tear came down my face, and my mom walks in the room right then. And she walks in the room, and there she sees me literally crying over spilled milk. And in that moment, my mom had some grace towards me. She saw a little tear coming down my face. She knelt down there next to the mess she didn't make. And she says, "Philip Andrew." And I knew that usually meant trouble, because that's my first name and my middle name, in case you didn't know. She said, "Philip Andrew, you have spilled all of your chocolate milk. Now then, go get a towel and clean it up. I'll pour you another glass of milk." And just like that, my mom, with 2 words, put a Band-Aid and a period on the problem and moved me to a next step. Now, there was no way to get all that milk up off the ground into the cup. I probably would have drank it, but there was no way to do it. What was done was tragic, but it had happened. But with 2 words, now then, my mom reframed the whole situation to accept what had happened and move forward. Friends, every now and again, you and I need now-then moments, don't we? We need moments where we just look at what happened, the train wreck of what just happened, and we stop trying to go back and change it, fix it, recreate it, live it, or get all that milk back in the cup again. There comes a point where we just say, that happened, now then. What's next? Now then. You see, Joshua had a choice to make. He could sit there and grieve and whine and complain about his past. He could have. He could have sat there feeling sorry for himself, asking God endless questions. He could have sat there and grieved there and died there. But you see, God knew his future. God knew that that wasn't the end for him. He just knew it was the end of a season. You might like summer, but summer doesn't last 12 months. Seasons have a beginning and they have an end. And there are times when the season is over, and even if it was a great season, God still has a future he's trying to get you to. He doesn't force it on you. But he was reminding Joshua, listen, it's not just about the here and now. Your past was good, but guess what? It's time for you to get up and get ready to cross over that Jordan, because over on the other side is the future that I have for you and your people. As long as you sit here grieving, you can't walk any further. But if you will just accept it and learn from it and move forward, I will get you where I've intended to take you. You see, God knows your situation. He knows where you're at, but he also knows your future. Do you believe that God knows your future? Do you believe that God knows your future, or are you unsure? I hope you know that. Well, Pastor Phil, I can't see my future from where I sit. Okay, since when does God have to show us stuff for us to believe it? Well, I would kind of like him to show me my future. All right. Well, you see, this requires a little element of faith. Do you think Joshua could see Israel from where he was sitting? No. On one side, he sees the wilderness, had been there, done that for 40 years. On the other side, he sees this impassable, immovable object, the Jordan River. He did not have a bridge. He did not have a boat. He did not have a subway. He couldn't go over it. He couldn't go around it. He couldn't go under it. Perhaps God wanted to take him through it. Why do we spend so much time asking God to take us over, around, and stuff when He just wants to take us through it? Just because you can't see it from where you're sitting doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You've got to have faith to believe that God has a future for you that you will like. Listen, if you can't believe God for next month's rent, how are you going to believe Him to save you from hell? If you can't believe that God's got a plan to get you a promotion, how in the world can you believe that He's going to stick up for you on Judgment Day? It's an element of faith. If we believe that God has a future for us, that puts some brackets around how upset we get when life changes on us. Because life's going to change, but God doesn't. Just because your life changes doesn't mean that God's going to renege on His promises. God knows where you're at. He knows your situation, but He also knows your future. And finally, God knows the plan. God knows the plan. I love a good plan. If you've ever put together a chair from IKEA or built a Lego castle, which unfortunately I'm 36 and I still build with Legos. I'm just going to confess that to you. And they have instructions. If you build an IKEA chair, it's probably going to have like 200 plus steps to it. You can't just start the plan on step 175. But I love a good plan. A plan is a series of properly ordered steps that if you stick to the plan, you will achieve a desired result. God has plans for you. He doesn't just say, I have a future, go find it. He has plans. He said He knows what they are. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans for a hope and a future. If the plan involves harm to you, it's not God's plan. He has plans. He has specific steps. He told Joshua what they were. He said, go tell the people to get up and get ready because we're about to cross over the Jordan. They hadn't heard that in 40 years. But God had a plan to get them across the Jordan. It wasn't like it was the first time the Israelites were kept from where they should go by a big body of water, was it? What happened when they came up to the Red Sea? God parted it and they walked across. If you read the story later, you know how they got across the Jordan River? God parted it, and they walked across. God has a plan to get you from where you are to where you're going, and He reminded Joshua of that. There's individual steps that you can take. God knew where he was. He knew his situation. He began to talk to him about his future, but He also wrote out a practical step-by-step plan to move Joshua forward. God always has a plan, and I love it when God's plan comes together. Let me close with this story. There's a young lady in this congregation who I admire deeply. Several years ago, she had earned her master's degree. She had a killer job in her field in North Atlanta and an amazing home of her own. She had a church family that she loved. Life was good for her. Then the economy tanked. And even though she had a great, high-paying job in the field that she loved, that she had studied for, that God opened up for her, that job was eliminated. Try as she might, she couldn't find any more work in her field. She was educated, she was successful, she was saved, but she was unemployed. When her finances finally reached their breaking point, she was left with no choice but to ask her parents if she could move back home until she figured out what was next. Do you know how tough that is? You've made your own way, you've got things going, and it gets that bad that you've got to call mom and dad and say, hey, can I come back home? That's hard for anybody. She was depressed, she was alone, she was understandably angry. She was misunderstood. She was directionless. She was grieving over her past until God came and found her and brought her a word. Here's what she says God said to her. Your old job is gone. Just kind of cut right to the chase. He said, your old life, it's dead. Now then, get up and get ready for what I have in store for you next. So she did as best she knew how. She felt like she ought to re-enroll in college and get a second master's degree, which she did, this time in education. Just a few short weeks after she started her master's degree, she was offered a full-time teaching position in her field, which allowed her to be in the classroom getting paid at the same time that she was finishing her education. A series of months went by and she kept working and working and working. She was working the plan. And then she graduated and she finished her degree. A short time later, she was offered a second job as an adjunct professor. She was able to retire her debt, get some funds together, and finally, a short time ago, just 2 or 3 months ago, she invited my wife and I to a housewarming party as she was able to secure a brand new place of her own. Now, I want to tell you something. Between the time that she had her crisis and she started tasting of her future, there was a series of months and steps that had to take place. Sometimes we want God to just step into our life and fast forward and get us right to our future now. That's not how His plan works. If we're not obedient to do the step in front of us, why should God give us steps 2 and so on and so forth? But God had a specific plan for her. For this young lady to enjoy the life God has for her today, here was a tough reality. For her to enjoy the life she has now, some other things had to change. Some other things had to end. A good job that God gave her had to end. The nice home that she had to be vacated. The great season she enjoyed had to become over. Yet somehow, some way, God continued to work her through His perfect plan for her life, one step at a time. Do you know what the harsh reality was for Joshua? Do you know what his harsh reality was? And this will mess some of you up, but here it is. Moses had to die. Moses had to die. Do you know why they were stuck where they were? Because Moses was still alive. Do you remember what God said to Moses when he disobeyed Him at the rock? When he struck the rock instead of speaking to it? He said, you are no longer eligible to lead this 1 million people from here into the promised land. As long as you're alive, they can't go there. And every day that Moses was alive and that season continued, it wasn't that it was a bad thing, it wasn't that it was an unhealthy thing, but they could go no further until that season ended. Unfortunately, and as difficult as for us to imagine, Moses had to die in order for Joshua to move forward. Friends, sometimes you and I get attached to things God never meant us to get attached to. And there's some of you this morning that are holding on to things in your past that might have even been good and that God brought in there at one point in your life. But today, you've got to loosen your grip a little bit or you're going to stay there and die there, never having realized what your future holds for you. That's scary, but that's the journey that God leads us on. Until Joshua had finished his time for grieving, and until he made a choice then and there to get up and get ready and move on, nobody could have entered into the destiny that God had for them. So friends, understand this. Just because one season is over in your life doesn't mean that God's forgotten about your future. Just because a season is over, a job has ended, a relationship is gone, a test was failed, your virginity was given away. Just because those things happen doesn't mean that your future's destroyed. Friend, you just need to have a now then moment. I can't tell you how many times people sit in my office, Pastor Phil, I don't know what to do. I gave my virginity away to somebody. And I look them right in the eyes and say, young man, young lady, yes, you did. It happened. Now then, learn from it and move forward and keep yourself pure until you're married. Pastor Phil, my job is over. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I'm doing everything I can to get it back. I'm asking them to reconsider. Friend, your job is over. Now then, get ready for what God has in store for you next. Pastor Phil, the most important relationship I had in my life is crumbled, it's gone, and I'm having a hard time with it. Friend, I understand. It is tough. It is difficult. When relationships end, we hurt, we grieve, and you should. Now then, let's talk about what your new normal will look like and how God can move you forward. Some of us just need from time to time a now then moment. God knows where you're at. He knows where to find you. He knows your situation. He knows your feelings. But friend, He also knows your future. He also has a plan to get you from here to there. So where are you at this morning? What is your situation? And what are you willing to let go of so that God can move you forward? Let's pray.